Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Anne Verhelst. I am a researcher on NATO and international law at KU Leuven. And on behalf of the America-Europe Fund and the German Marshall Fund, I am delighted that we are all here today together to talk about NATO's new strategy and the rise of China. As it has become clear that the global power competition will occupy a central place in transatlantic security in the years ahead, there is a lot of interest and curiosity as to what the alliance's policy toward China will look like. A policy which will be solidified in the upcoming strategic concept that NATO will adopt this year. This new NATO strategic concept will be the first one NATO will adopt in over a decade. The last one from 2010, not even mentioning China with one word. A lot has changed since. Most recently, NATO leaders, for the very first time ever, agreed that China poses a systemic challenge. And so, it is extremely relevant and timely that we have with us today three truly excellent speakers who will shed light on how NATO is dealing with the strategic implications of China's rise. And today marks a very special occasion because this is actually the very first joint webinar that the German Marshall Fund and the America-Europe Fund are organizing. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank the wonderful team at the German Marshall Fund and the America-Europe Fund for bringing this all together. For those of you not yet familiar with the America-Europe Fund, the America-Europe Fund is a newly launched fund hosted at KU Leuven, which supports and promotes academic cooperation, exchange, and research to strengthen transatlantic ties. And so today's topic, NATO's new strategy and the rise of China, is a dream fit for this very first joint webinar. Now, to give you a bit of a roadmap, what we will do is that in the next hour and a half, we'll have our distinguished speakers give their initial remarks, followed by a moderated debate and then Q&A. And we're so very grateful to see a large audience presence, and we would like to encourage you to address any question you may have for the panelists through the Q&A function below. You may submit your questions at any time throughout the webinar. I will pick them up and integrate them into the debate. And now, please let me introduce our three all-stars speakers representing both the American and the European voice. Starting with Dr. Aaron Friedberg, who is Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University and Senior Fellow at GMF. We're very happy to have with us as well Mr. Robert Dreesen, who is Policy Planning Advisor in the Office of the NATO Secretary General at NATO headquarters and a Dutch diplomat. And last but not least, the second European voice of today is given by Dr. Stephanie Bakst, who is joining us from London, where she is Principal and Global Policy Advisor at Bruce Associates and Senior Associate Fellow at the European Leadership Network. And so Aaron, Robert, and Stephanie, I think we're all very curious to hear your views on how NATO is dealing with the strategic implications of China's rise and how this will affect EU-US relations. So it is with great pleasure that I give the floor first to you, Aaron, for about 5 minutes of initial remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. It's a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon, good morning. I thought I might begin by saying a few remarks about what appears to me the larger strategic context in which this discussion is going forward, and then conclude with some thoughts about the role that NATO might play in dealing with the challenge posed by China's rise. It's ironic, but I think not coincidental, that just at this moment, just as NATO begins to turn its attention to the strategic challenge that China poses, Russia has chosen to initiate a campaign of aggression unlike anything that we've seen since 2014, and indeed since the end of the Cold War. What's been happening over the last several years, what we've observed is a pattern of increasingly close cooperation and coordination between Beijing and Moscow. Some of this is overt military exercises, both in the Atlantic and the Pacific. Some of it undoubtedly covert, for example, sharing of information about the effectiveness of cyber operations, perhaps consultation regarding Russian and Chinese responses to Kazakhstan. We don't know this for sure, but I suspect that there's more going on that we're not seeing. And some of this cooperation is tacit, not necessarily explicit or planned. So, for example, in the current crisis, Mr. Putin no doubt had a variety of reasons for stepping up pressure on Ukraine, but it just so happens that he's done so at a moment when the United States, and to a lesser extent, but an important degree, NATO, have begun trying to focus more of their energy and resources on China. And as the Soviets used to say, I suspect that this is no accident. The increasing closeness between Russia and China is driven by a variety of factors, of which I think the deepest and perhaps the most important is a shared fear of and animosity towards what the Chinese now refer to as the so-called universal values of the liberal democratic West, and the threat that these pose to the legitimacy of the Russian and Chinese regimes. After 2014, the impetus for closer cooperation came from Moscow, which of course faced economic and diplomatic pressure as a result of its actions against Ukraine. In the last several years, Beijing appears to be the driving force. In anticipation of increasing tension and perhaps confrontation with the United States, Xi Jinping has been seeking to reduce China's vulnerability to possible sanctions, embargoes, blockades, and Russia is especially important here. It provides a proximate overland source of energy and also food that can't be cut off, even if China should be denied access to the sea. And so we've seen recently a second major gas pipeline deal, but also over the last 2 years, very significant increases in Russian agricultural exports to China. China and Russia are authoritarian states that see themselves constrained, encircled, and threatened by the liberal democracies led by the United States. They're attempting both separately and in concert to change important aspects of the existing international order. So they are revisionist powers. The challenge they pose is collective and requires a collective response. At least on paper, this shouldn't be difficult. If you look at the aggregate resources of the democracies in Europe, in the Asia Pacific, in the Western Hemisphere, the gross domestic product of those countries taken together, so the large, primarily advanced industrial democracies, is over half of total global GDP, whereas China and Russia together, by contrast, account for only about 20%. So that disparity, although it doesn't translate immediately into usable power, but the existence of that disparity is one of the reasons why, among their major objectives, China and Russia seek to keep their opponents divided. At the same time, however, both China and Russia still need access to Western markets, capital, technology. So they're walking a very thin line. They're pushing hard, but trying not to provoke the Western powers into cutting them off. So in short, the democracies have enormous resources and enormous potential leverage that they have thus far, for a variety of reasons, chosen not fully to use. The challenge posed by China in particular is not exclusively and perhaps even primarily military. And so NATO's response has to be one part of a larger European and transatlantic response to that challenge. And in some areas, this will have to be collective, but not military. So, for example, issues regarding China's mercantilist trading policies or its human rights abuses, not appropriate for those to be taken up by NATO, perhaps, but the EU would seem to be the proper venue. Another significant challenge that all democratic countries face, including and even especially those in Europe, are influence operations, both from China and from Russia, and those require coordination among police and intelligence agencies, but again, not a NATO responsibility. That said, NATO clearly has an important role, or rather a variety of roles, I think, to play in dealing with the rise of China and the challenge that poses. It can make contributions, it is making contributions to maintaining a favorable balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, not so much via direct deployments, but among other things, through arms sales, intelligence sharing, joint training, and other forms of defense cooperation with Asian countries, individually and collectively, so Japan, Korea, Australia, India, Taiwan. And also, of course, it can and should make greater contributions by spending more on European defense so that the United States can devote more of its scarce resources to Asia. NATO also has a role to play in helping to counter threats from China that are non-terrestrial, including the development of its capabilities for conducting operations in space and in cyberspace. NATO also can play a part in preserving an edge for the Western democratic countries in emerging technologies by pooling resources for collaborative research and development, and also by encouraging European governments to take steps to protect critical technologies from extraction by China. NATO also has a role to play in identifying and helping to mediate threats to mobility and mobilization that might result from Chinese ownership of transportation and communications infrastructure. And also, I think, in preparing for possible operations in areas outside but adjacent to the main theaters of a possible future conflict in the Indo-Pacific. And these might include the Persian Gulf, Mediterranean, even the Atlantic, especially if China proceeds with establishing military facilities on the western coast of Africa. American officials have taken to using the term integrated deterrence when they describe their objectives with regard to China or their strategy for dealing with China. And I think what that means is deploying a full array of instruments and tools to try to persuade China that aggression in Asia would be met by a collective global response, not just a military response, but a diplomatic and economic response coming not just from the United States or from countries in Asia, but also from European powers as well. And in that regard, at least for the moment, the most important thing I think that NATO can do to strengthen integrated deterrence in the Indo-Pacific is to conduct an effective response to Russia's recent aggression in Ukraine, because that will send a powerful signal, good or bad, back to Beijing about the resolve of the Western powers. So with that, let me stop.
Thank you so very much, Aaron, and thank you for taking Russia on in the debate immediately and reminding us about the holistic vision on global power competition, because it's true that the most recent NATO summit communique mentions Russia 61 times, while China only 10 times. And thank you for formulating concrete proposals, because that is what is currently lacking or still a bit vague on the official NATO side. And that is why it is perfect that we have Robert with us, who can shed some light on what we may expect from the upcoming strategic concept and what we may expect in terms of a NATO-China policy. With great pleasure, the floor is yours, Robert.
Thank you very much, Anne. It is a great pleasure to be here and to share this virtual stage with the distinguished other speakers. As you pointed out, I will focus my remarks now mostly on the strategic concept, and then I'd be happy to go into more of the questions related to how does NATO approach China, any other questions during the Q&A. So first of all, as you mentioned in your introduction, I work in the policy planning unit, which is part of the Office of the Secretary General of NATO. And as such, we advise the Secretary General on mid to long-term challenges for NATO. And as such, we also have an advising role to play when it comes to the strategic concept. At the last summit on the 14th of June in Brussels, the NATO leaders asked the Secretary General to take the lead in developing this next strategic concept. And as you pointed out, this is something that is not very frequent at NATO. There is no fixed term for renewing the strategic concept, but in practice it has been reviewed more or less every decade, sometimes a bit longer, sometimes a bit shorter. So the last one dates from 2010, and as has been made perfectly clear by you as well as by Aaron, the world has moved on quite a lot from there. Now, what does a strategic concept do? Strategic concept is really a key document for the alliance. In fact, only the Washington Treaty stands above the strategic concept in NATO's hierarchy. So as such, the strategic concept reaffirms NATO's values, purpose, overall tasks. It gives, very importantly, a collective allied assessment of our security environment and what it is we are facing now, but also what it is we expect to face in the next 10 years or more. As such, a strategic concept also drives the ongoing adaptation of the alliance. And another aspect that has become more important in recent decades with the strategic concept is that it also has a very important messaging role to fulfill. Strategic concepts during the Cold War were classified and not published. That changed afterwards. And now it's eagerly expected. So it's also a tool of communicating to our own audiences and also to our adversaries, potential competitors, name it what you like. 1 year is not a lot of time to develop a strategic concept, but as I think you and many of the audience know, in doing so we can draw on a process that has been started earlier in December 2019, which is the NATO 2030 process aimed at reinvigorating the political dimension as well as other aspects of the alliance. So in this NATO 2030 process, a lot of advice has been gathered from allies, but also from other different stakeholders, and this will also feed into the strategic concept again. And the Secretary General sort of leads the process of developing the strategic concept by first having a series of internal consultations with allies, but also consultations with NATO's partner countries, partner organizations, and other stakeholders. And after that, in the sort of final months before the Madrid summit, where the strategic concept will have to be adopted, there will be negotiations with the allies about the exact text. That also means that at this stage, I can, of course, not preempt and say what will be in the strategic concept. However, there are some general lines out there, and there's some guidance that have been given that is quite clear. And I would like to point particularly at a speech that the Secretary General gave on the 30th of November in Riga, just ahead of the foreign ministers meeting, where he pointed out 5 key things that he would like to see in the next strategic concept. The first one is that the strategic concept should reaffirm NATO's values and reinforce NATO's role in protecting these values at home and abroad. The second one is that the strategic concept should be very clear about the need for NATO to stay strong militarily. And the situation that we are seeing now with Russia's unprecedented military buildup underlines how important this collective defense function of NATO is and will be going forward. A third element that the strategic concept should serve is to step up NATO's role in strengthening our societies. And this has to do with the fact that the security challenges we're facing are becoming more diverse, and they're no longer exclusively in the military domain. So if NATO wants to fulfill its role of ensuring the security of its citizens, it also has to look at resilience, at hybrid tactics, and have an effective policy and way forward in that sense. The fourth element for the strategic concept is that NATO needs to have a global outlook. This does not mean that NATO has to become sort of a global policeman. NATO is and will remain an organization with a regional mandate. But as Aaron already pointed out, some of the challenges we face right now are not territorial in nature. And there are important spillover effects from the regions adjacent to us, but also from regions further afield. NATO is part of the institutional order that is put under pressure by autocratic regimes. And as such, NATO has to be aware and has to engage with the rest of the world in order to fulfill its regional mandate to keep its own citizens in the North Atlantic region safe. The final element, and that relates a bit to what I was saying before, is that the strategic concept should play an important role of reaffirming NATO as the indispensable link between Europe and North America. So what does all of this mean, of course, for the role that China plays and the role of China? While, again, we cannot preempt what will be in the strategic concept exactly, I'm personally very, very confident that there will be substantial China language in the strategic concept, because the alliance has moved forward quite a lot in China since actually London 2019, when for the very first time even the word China was mentioned in a leader's statement. China will figure in the strategic concept as such, not as an adversary, because NATO does not see China as an adversary, but in relation to the aspects of the rise of China that impact us. China is becoming more active in our own region and in the regions around us. China is impacting the international rules-based order, and as such, we have the obligation almost to consider that and to develop a strategy about that. In doing so, we will, of course, build on the consensus that has been growing amongst allies on how to deal with China. And Anne, you already mentioned the NATO summit communique. Actually, that does have some important hooks that can be used as a stepping stone towards a further NATO strategy towards China. It includes the element of the importance of China living up to its international commitments and acting as a responsible player. We see that allies have converged on voicing concern about certain aspects of China's behavior, including its non-transparent military buildup, its coercive behavior against other countries, its undermining of the international rules-based order, and I think that on a personal note I can add to that what Aaron said about Chinese links with Russia are also something that, of course, are of importance for NATO to consider. Finally, allies are also very clear, and the Secretary General himself is also clear, that NATO also wants to dialogue with China. We need principled engagement with China based on, you know, what their interests are, but also on our interests, on our mutual interests. So in that sense, we are talking here about an approach to China that is not confrontational, but that is realistic and should make sure that the alliance will be able to deal with the rise of China in the years ahead in a responsible and effective way. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Robert, for sketching out the process of making up a strategic concept. I think that's extremely insightful for all of us. And thank you as well for giving us an idea of 5 key things that will be in the strategic concept. And then that links us perfectly to Stephanie, because my question would be, what should be in the strategic concept? I read, Stephanie, that you recently wrote that NATO could, for example, develop a dual track strategy towards China. And I would love to hear your views on that, and I think the audience as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Anne, and good afternoon, good morning from not London, but from the northern part of Germany to everybody who has tuned in. I will try to make it short, crispy, and interesting. I haven't really prepared a lengthy statement or anything like that, but I'd be happy to share 2, 3, or 4 quick observations with you that hopefully I could help to get us going in the discussion. My number 1 point is we are late. We are late in the game. NATO has been pretty late in the game of realizing that China is not just China, but that we are actually dealing with a continental power who has a number of statecraft tools at its proposal to influence the international order from all types, from all perspectives, through all means, and ultimately even perhaps would have the statecraft tools to change, to alter the international order. That's indeed quite a challenge. And I have observed over the past 20 years that, as you know, I spent in NATO in different capacities, that NATO has always been a little bit late in the game when it comes to acknowledging that there is really something important out there on the strategic horizon. But on China, I think we were particularly late. And I really, really regret this, because during the time of, or between 2002 and 2013-14, we actually had what I would call a nascent relationship with China. We had engagements with China. There were not just here and there a nice conversation between the former Secretary Generals of NATO and Chinese ambassadors who visited the NATO headquarters, but we had military to military contacts. We had high-level visits traveling to China, and we had military high-level visits coming to NATO. We had agreements about exchanging views about counterterrorism, maritime security, and many others. I myself hosted a couple of Chinese party officials, diplomats, and the like. So there was a time when we actually had some form of engagement with China, and then we lost it. And why did we lose it? Because of Russia's invasion of illegal annexation of Crimea and eastern Ukraine. Political attention in capitals, including in Brussels, really, really drifted hard towards Russia, and we kind of like started to neglect China. And that was, I think, quite a mistake, because during these critical years, I'm talking the 2020, so I mean between 2010 and 2018 and so on, China actually created fait accompli. It created its Belt and Road. It bought ports, infrastructure, and communication. It signed partnership agreements with a number of allies. So as an end result, as this current Secretary General rightly observes, China has already landed in our midst without that we on NATO's side were quick enough, smart enough, and probably even alert enough to start what I would call, crafting a strategy, getting really a meaningful political transatlantic debate ongoing about not just analyzing and observing what China is doing, but actually thinking hard how we might want to respond to China's rise in the long run. And that has basically put us in the situation where we are now. China, as already said, has landed in Europe, in our governments, not governments, but in our countries, in our infrastructure, in our midst. And so it's quite hard to actually develop a strategy to not necessarily and completely decouple, because that would be politically quite unrealistic, but really push back a little bit. That's my number 2 point. My number 1 point, sorry. My number 2 point is really that I have advocated for some time already that we would need transatlantic wise to not just identify language on China in the new strategic concept. I agree with you, Robert, it's important. What the allies, the leaders will ultimately agree on the new strategic concept on China. But we are not talking about language. We are talking about the need to have a dedicated, comprehensive strategy. And the strategy should really describe the ultimate end state, our ultimate strategic objective. What is it that we want to, or how is it we want to position ourselves vis-a-vis China, not just now, but in the next decade from now? And what is it, that we think we need to do in terms of both defending against China, but at the same time also keeping the door open for identifying areas where we at least converge. It would pretty much help, I think, if our American friends, if the Biden administration had already a nice template in place, a US-China strategy. But that's not the case. It's work in progress. It's an evolving process. And I'm not really sure where ultimately the United States, this administration, will end up. I hear a lot the term containment. We need to contain China. And then again, I ask myself the question, but what would be the ultimate rationale? Again, the strategic objective of containing China. I personally don't think, that should be the rationale. And then we have, just to give another example, we have on our side of the pond, we have the Europeans, namely the European Union, who in contrast to NATO already have a dedicated strategy on China in place. And that's the fact for already a number of years. And what I think is quite interesting with the European Union's approach to China is that in particular over the past couple of years, you see that consensus within the Europeans have started to shift from looking at China not so much as a benign trading partner and economic partner, but also at China as a comprehensive entity that also entails security, technological, and other related risks. So my wish would be certainly that NATO allies would start to sit down and actually craft such a strategy, which I would argue would need to be at least a bit like other strategies that we have developed over time, would have at least 2 components. A clear deterrence and defense message to also show China the red lines, really red lines, really clear messages, what we would not allow China to do. And at the same time, also make a meaningful offer for dialogue, eventually even practical cooperation. My number 3 point is, that because of, and Aaron said so, and Robert alike, many of our countries have already close economic ties to China. And if I observe political debates from Paris to Bratislava, from Berlin to London, I don't have the feeling, that capitals, governments, at least current governments, would be prepared to completely decouple from China. So we would need to come up with a comprehensive approach towards China. And ideally, that needs to be done in tandem, which is NATO and the European Union. I have long advocated NATO and the European Union not just comparing notes, but really getting their grips together. And I must admit, perhaps at the risk of sounding here too critical, but I find it really absolutely bizarre. I mean, that the European Union is about to finalize its strategic compass, and there is clearly a lot of not just language, but principle consideration, reflections on China. And in downtown Brussels, in Nevers, work has started on the strategic concept, and yet there is hardly interaction. And I'm not saying, because I'm very well aware of that, I mean that yes, on the senior level, the Secretary General of NATO and his counterparts in the European Union, they get together. What I'm talking about is staff level work. I'm talking really systematic, joint up work on the broader two concepts, but clearly really on China as well. One of the things that I did when I was still leading NATO strategic foresight staff, I went to actually go to, I guess I'm not revealing a secret here, but one of my first things I did, I went to see Gunnar Wiegand. Yeah, I mean, he is the longtime Chinese, the Chinese guy in the action service, has a fabulous, competent team and knows much more, knew much more about China than we back then, at least in 2018, 19, and 20, knew at NATO. So there are counterparts on the European Union side. And however, ultimately, this strategy, this approach should be shaped, I would certainly argue that we would need to do this in close tandem with the European Union. And last but not least, that's my final point. I think it's worth investing into not just talking about China, but talking with China. And here I don't reveal a secret when I say I'm a strong advocate, have always been, of informal track 2 processes. I know a number of, for instance, US-based think tanks from Carnegie all the way to others. They're engaging in these informal discussions with Chinese counterparts. I have told you that I'm about to also launch a dedicated report on that because I've been involved in such a dedicated process. And I find it, without that I'm naive, absolutely not, about China, but I find it important that we also get back, to this people-to-people conversation and try to identify areas where we eventually, could discover joint interests or at least converging interests with the Chinese. There are issues such as climate change, counterterrorism, maritime security, perhaps even, if I just say off the top of my head, how to set up cyber norms. Of course, we need to do this with the Chinese. Of course. Other than that, it wouldn't make sense. Arms control issues is another big field where we haven't been able to only open a door to China yet. So I think there is a lot of space that needs to be worked on. I'm not saying that we can do it all overnight, but I'm hopeful, that we need to get going on this now. Now. Thank you. I stop here.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for a clear message of which we remember that it's probably time to move from language to crafting a strategy. And that ties in nicely with a discussion I would like to have with you on concrete actions. And if we talk about action, I heard from Robert, resilience. I heard from you, Aaron and Stephanie, protecting critical infrastructure, technological advancement, economic regulation. And then it must come to our minds that the importance of NATO-EU cooperation, right? So perhaps, Aaron, you could give us your American perspective on how important NATO-EU cooperation is in this transatlantic approach towards China, and where you think the EU should step in or not step in. And then perhaps we can move to Robert, because I wanted to ask you whether you see this NATO-EU cooperation as posing a challenge to allied unity. And then Robert, maybe picking up on what Stephanie said, are there also positive elements for cooperation with China? Because the NATO summit communique mentions only climate change, but perhaps there's something we're forgetting. So please, Aaron, you have the floor.
Well, as an American, I'm reluctant to tell people in Europe what they should do, particularly in the EU. I'm struck by what Stephanie said. It certainly coincides with my own perception of what's been going on, that the EU in many respects has been moving forward in defining the challenges that China poses, moving away from what was perhaps an overly optimistic view of where the relationship was headed, and developing new language, describing China as a systemic rival, but not just that, beginning to develop various tools and policies to try to counter some of China's aggressive economic policies. So it is striking that the EU is, I think, out in front, and NATO continues to run behind to catch up. There are good reasons for that. But as I indicated, if you accept the view, which I think is correct, that China is a challenger that poses challenges across the full array of domains and has all of the various instruments of power at its disposal and seeks to use them to accomplish objectives, some of which are inimical, I think, to the interests and the values of Western democratic countries. If that's the case, then it follows that some kind of coordinated, integrated response is necessary. My observation of the American government is that we are also behind in that regard. We're very good at some parts of this problem, and we have enormous bureaucratic machines that are focused on parts of it, but we're not very good on other parts, particularly on some of the economic aspects. And we are also not very good at integrating across our bureaucracies to try to achieve some degree of coordination. So even internally, that's a problem here. But it seems to me that in Europe, there has to be a significant role for the EU, because so many of these problems are not purely or primarily military problems. It seems that there would also be possibilities for exchanges of information that could assist both parties in developing appropriate policies. Two quick further comments on that. One concern always, of course, is that because NATO and even more the EU are large agglomerations of states with their various interests that sometimes diverge, they're also, EU particularly, has been susceptible to divide and conquer tactics on the part of the Chinese. We haven't seen that quite so much with NATO, but that's a concern. It's not as obvious, but that's a concern there as well. China pursuing policies towards France or towards Germany or towards Britain, which and some of the smaller countries as well, that they hope will pull those countries away from whatever consensus might be emerging, or even play a role in blocking a consensus. And that the concern, I think, is that you get, if anything, a sort of lowest common denominator policy or strategy that's not going to be very effective. So as we think about what we should do, we also, I think, have to be aware of what China is trying to do to us to make it difficult for us to respond in an effective way. One final point, it's something I had meant to emphasize. I touched on it glancingly, but I wanted to say it. It seems to me that NATO has a role to play in public education in Europe in particular, that for NATO officials to be giving the kinds of speeches that the General Secretary gave, to be talking about the challenge that China poses in the language that has been used recently, I think is extremely important and beneficial. It means that it's not simply American officials coming and appearing to hector their European counterparts and scare them into doing things that maybe they don't want to do, but that within Europe and within government circles, there is an increasing awareness of, and I think convergence on, the importance of responding to this growing challenge. So that is a NATO role as well. And it's related to some of the things like infrastructure. Even if NATO itself doesn't have the authority to address some of those problems directly, by identifying the problems that infrastructure vulnerabilities could pose to NATO and its ability to conduct operations if it needed to do so, it may be able to encourage European governments and the EU to do some things that are necessary to defend.
Thank you so very much, Aaron, for these interesting reflections and for pointing as well to potential divergences amongst European nations themselves towards the strategy. And I think that goes back to the question I wanted to ask you, Robert, how you see the importance of NATO-EU cooperation, and might this also be another challenge to NATO unity, but also to the unity amongst European allies themselves, because I can imagine that visions on approaching China differ amongst them as well. And then, as I said, perhaps you could pick in on what Stephanie said and enlighten us whether there are any other domains other than climate change where NATO could, in a positive way, cooperate with China or is intending to. And before I give you the floor, I see some questions coming in from the audience. We're very happy about that. So please keep them coming, address them through the Q&A below, and I'll integrate them into the debate. The floor is yours, Robert. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm not that pessimistic. I mean, I see when it comes to China, NATO-EU cooperation as an opportunity and not necessarily as a challenge. In fact, I can reassure Stephanie that also after she left HQ, there are a lot of staff-to-staff contacts between NATO and the EU. So it's not just at the principal level, but just speaking for myself, I mean, in the NATO policy planning staff, we have a lot of contacts with the policy planning staff at the EEAS, with colleagues at the Commission, and also with the team that is working on the strategic compass. So besides the formal briefings, there's also staff-to-staff exchanges. That being said, the compass and the concept are two documents of a very different nature, and NATO and the EU each have their own role to play. So whereas we exchange a lot of views and information and try to make sure that, you know, we sing a bit from the same song sheet, we are not going in it's not feasible nor desirable to align the two documents in a way that one sort of dictates what the other says. Coming back to China and the NATO-EU challenge and NATO-EU, I think that Aaron said gave some elements that are very, very valuable and that speak also to the way that the European Union can take actions that NATO cannot. For example, when it comes to regulatory powers, industrial policies, etc. These are crucial to our economic resilience, and nowadays one can no longer make a clear distinction between economic security and other types of security, so we have to consider that. And that's where, you know, the European Union has some instruments that NATO does not have. On the other hand, NATO has other assets and expertise that the EU cannot bring to the table. And one important element here I would like to point out is that when we talk about a transatlantic community, not all the nations are covered by just a US-EU dialogue. North America is more than just the US, includes Canada as well, and Europe is more than just the European Union. And here NATO does have a lot of added value as a political forum for exchange, bringing in also important allies that are not part of a US-EU conversation. That speaks to the value of NATO, not just as a military alliance, but also as a political alliance. Moving to the question about dialoguing with China and positive elements, indeed, that is something that is part of, you know, what NATO strives to do. We want to keep a positive dialogue with China, and, you know, climate was mentioned in the in the communique. But I think the communique also refers quite explicitly to the value of mutual transparency, especially in the fields of arms control. I think it's important to have this dialogue with China, and to make sure that that as China further develops its nuclear capacities and missile capacities, it also acts as the responsible international player that it needs to be. I mean, having these types of weapons and having more of these types of weapons also brings the responsibility to engage in discussions about the responsible deployment of them, and engaging also in the talks to control them, even diminish them where possible, in a mutually beneficial way. So I think arms control is definitely something that's on the agenda. Stephanie mentioned a few other areas that could also be, in my personal view, promising in principle. I mean, in the past, as you pointed out, we already talked about maritime effects. I mean, we had a dialogue about Afghanistan. Afghanistan is also something that was very high on the agenda when the Secretary General met virtually with the Chinese foreign minister in September of last year. So there's regional elements that we want to discuss, that we can discuss also with China in cases where both NATO and China have an interest. Finally, I would also like to point out here that when we talk about dialogue and engagement, it is also very important for NATO to step up our engagement with our partners and other stakeholders in the Indo-Pacific region. We have 4 partners in the region: Australia, New Zealand, the Republic of Korea, and Japan. And we have, intermittent contacts and dialogues with many others, including Singapore, India, etc. These conversations are also very important as we go forward on charting a way towards China, because these countries understand China's behavior very well, and we can learn a lot from them. Finally, one remark about what has been said about NATO not having a strategy and an approach. I think that Stephanie, in a way, is right when noticing that NATO was not the first organization to publish its view about China. In a way, that's also logical, given NATO's mandate and role. But I would like to stress here that what goes out to the public, of course, in an organization like NATO, is the tip of the iceberg. So a few lines in a communique indicate a lot more work being done inside the NATO organization in terms of our awareness about China, preparing for the impact that China has, partnerships with others in the region, and also principled engagement with China. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Robert. Very insightful. Thank you for underlying the value that NATO plays as a political fora for not only the European and American allies. And thank you for identifying arms cooperation, Afghanistan, and maritime security as areas for dialogue. That answers to a few questions from the audience, actually. So thank you for that. And what is perfect, you've given me a very good segue to go back to Stephanie, talking about partners, because indeed NATO in its most recent communique said that it will amplify its efforts in cooperating with Australia, South Korea, Japan, in approaching China. And I want to ask you, Stephanie, how do you see this evolving? Do you think that cooperation should be more assertive? Do you see a regional role for NATO there? And or do you think that economic bonds of those different countries might hamper transatlantic security cooperation? What are your thoughts about this, please?
Thank you, Anne. The Asia-Pacific region as such is a highly complex web of interstate relations, multilateral structures, bilateral structures, historically built long-term grievances. I mean, what I'm saying is it's a really, really complex world in itself. And I think whatever individual allies or NATO collectively try to do in that region would need to take that setting and the dynamics behind really into consideration. I'm not always sure that we fully comprehend. I mean, what is really or how complex this web of interrelations are. I mean, we have started to focus. That takes us back to the times of the Secretary General Jaap de Rob Scheffer. Yeah? I mean, I'm looking at Robert, your Dutch colleague. You know, he was the first one going out and saying, you know, NATO doesn't want to become the global gendarme du monde, but we would like to reach out to other democracies like South Korea, Japan, India, etc. And let's see and how, I mean, once we go along that way and discuss where we actually converge and what we could do jointly. And this is basically what we have seen over the past 10 and more years. And I think that's good. It's good, I mean, that we have now really solid partnerships with Japan, New Zealand, Australia, and others in place. But there are many other players in the region. And one player I would particularly put my attention to is certainly India. Yeah? I'm not saying the others, I mean, don't matter, but India has always been an important player politically, strategically, economically. It has its own dynamic relationship with Beijing. But at the end of the day, it's often being said, the only and largest democracy out there in the region. So I would certainly also engage India. I know that looking back at NATO archives, also there was a type of nation relationship, but I'm not talking 2 or 3 meetings nicely crafted and put together by, you know, senior leaders. I'm talking really more of a robust relationship. And that has been quite difficult with the Indians over the past years. They were not always too eager to engage with NATO. But I think if you really would like to make your voice heard in that difficult regional setting, not an exclusively geared towards China, but also taking into account, I mean, the balance of power in the region itself, which is changing and has been changing in the past, I would certainly also very, very much address India. At least I'd try. Some capitals have already done so, but I think that would be certainly something that I would put on my list of things to do if I were to reach out. But the partnerships that we have cultivated as NATO over the past years, they're solid and they're good and they're valuable. The elephant in the room, and that here I stop because I think there are questions about this that perhaps for, I mean, my 2 colleagues, Aaron and Robert, would like to also respond to. The elephant in the room is obviously Taiwan. What's going to happen to Taiwan? And what would that mean for the region? How would the other actors react? How would and could we react as the West? What would be eventually Washington's response? And there is a plethora of questions involved, but that's the elephant in the room. And I think we need to spell it out.
Thank you so very much, Stephanie, for reminding us to embrace the complexity of the Asia-Pacific region with India and Taiwan as well. That ties into questions of the audience as well. And another theme that is emerging from the audience's questions, for which we're very grateful, and please keep them coming, goes back to what I think Adam very legitimately raised at the beginning of this webinar, which is Russia, China. And if I group the question, the thing is that from the NATO summit communique and the NATO 2030 agenda, it is quite clear that Russia still is at the forefront of leaders' minds. And my question would be, do you see this focus on Russia from NATO's side as legitimate still, desirable? Do you see it as something that the European allies are pushing for, notably? And how can we ensure credible deterrence against Russia while looking for ways to constrain China's growing influence here in the Euro-Atlantic region? My questions to you, Aaron. Thank you very much.
Well, I think the Russia focus, or the concern about Russia, certainly now, is not only legitimate, it's inescapable. When a country is doing the things that Russia has been doing, which are really quite shocking in the context of post-World War II history, the kinds of threats that they're making, the mobilization of forces. Of course, it's necessary to focus on it. It can't be escaped. My concern, as I mentioned at the beginning, is that this may result not only in a temporary deflection or a temporary concentration on the proximate problem, but perhaps deflect attention from a longer term effort that's just getting started for NATO to also pay greater attention to China. And as I said, I don't think that's entirely accidental. I believe that Russia and China are, as I said, cooperating in a variety of ways, some of which are visible, some of which may not be, some of which are explicit, and some of which are tacit. And that needs to be met and responded to in a coordinated way. As far as deterrence, I mean, I know this isn't a seminar about Ukraine and deterring Russia from using force against Ukraine. And I guess, although the elephant in the room has been mentioned, Taiwan, and perhaps we should talk about that. That's also a big and complex issue. But these two are similar in certain respects, in that they are both under threat, both democracies under threat, both falling outside the envelope of existing security arrangements, Ukraine and Taiwan both. There is a deterrence problem in both cases. And I think in both cases, the steps that are necessary to strengthen deterrence are, of course, first and foremost, military, but they extend beyond that, because I think both China and Russia are showing an inclination to take risks. The Russians more than the Chinese, but the Chinese more than they used to 10 or 15 years ago when they were weaker. And that danger is going to grow. And I think that means that they are susceptible to influence. They can be deterred, but their decisions about whether to use force are going to be shaped by calculations that extend beyond the kind of narrow military considerations. And in particular, I think they involve concerns about the possible response, not only by the United States, not only by European countries in the case of Ukraine, or Asian countries in the case of Taiwan, but the sort of collective response, and whether there is going to be a collective response from the democracies to this potential aggression by revisionist authoritarian powers. I think that if leaders in Moscow and Beijing looked at those situations and concluded that in fact there would be a coordinated, comprehensive, and far-reaching response in the economic domain as well as in others, it would give them pause. But I'm not sure that that's what they believe as they look now. In the case of Russia, I mean, it's really quite remarkable, given the things that Russia is doing, that Europe continues to have the kind of economic relations that it does with Russia. If the Russians don't use force against Ukraine, my guess would be it's because they have become convinced that if they did so, there would be a far-reaching shift in the economic relationship. In the case of with Europe, in the case of Taiwan, the calculations are more complicated. But there too, as I indicated, if Xi Jinping and his generals looking across the Taiwan Straits at this objective that they've had and that their predecessors had for decades before them, conclude not only that the use of force would carry a significant risk of failing in a military sense, but that it would almost certainly bring down on China a coordinated and costly economic response, it would give them pause. The problem in both instances is that authoritarian leaders have to become convinced that democratic societies and the leaders of democratic societies are willing to do things which not only impose costs on their opponents, but impose costs on their own societies. And I'm afraid that they don't believe that as much as I would like them to at this point. And that's one of the reasons I'm concerned.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you for sharing your reflections and your concerns. And if I may ask a follow-up question, a very relevant one asked by the audience. You mentioned it the other way around before, but now the person in the audience is asking, is China taking advantage of this public distraction now created at the Ukrainian border? And if so, in what ways?
I don't see evidence that they're taking advantage of it in a sort of tactical sense. I'm not concerned that because the US may be more focused on Europe right now, that China is going to invade Taiwan. I don't think that's the way they make their strategic calculations, but they're opportunistic. And I'm sure that they hope that this crisis will drag on. I'm sure they hope that it will distract the United States, the Biden administration, and preoccupy it, that it will delay or maybe even derail the discussions that are going on now within NATO about how to respond over the long term to the growth of Chinese power. They're not counting on it, but it's very much to their benefit. At the same time, it's possible, and I'm sure that they take account of this, that the emergence of this threat could conceivably have a galvanizing impact. So they may be wrong. They may look at what happened in 2014 and think that, well, this will just distract Europe for another better part of another decade, but maybe not. Maybe if there is a growing sense of as I said, a collective challenge, not just one or the other, but both Russia and China together, it may speed the development of a more effective collective response. That's a little more optimistic than I usually am, but that's what I would hope. And I would hope also that Western leaders in Europe, and I hope also in the United States, are looking at this situation through that lens, not just focusing on the short-term, immediate, most pressing problem, but not taking their eye off the larger challenge. I hope that's the case. People say US administrations can't deal with more than one crisis at a time. And I used to think that that wasn't true. And then I spent a couple of years working in the government and I became convinced that it was. So I'm afraid that it's going to eat up a lot of mental time and resources as long as the crisis drags on. And that's not good because we need all we can to deal with China.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you for your moment of optimism and for comparing, I think, very insightfully the situation to the events which happened in 2014. You mentioned the short term and the long term. I would like to go back to the rather short term because we have an interesting question, I think perfectly fit for Robert from the audience, which is, what role do you see for the French presidency of the EU now with the NATO strategic concept coming up? And may I add to that, that indeed after the recent NATO summit, Macron made statements that we shouldn't approach China with a bias and that NATO might not have the correct tools to address China, might not be the right format even, he said, to address China's rise. So I would love to hear your views on that. Robert, please, you have the floor.
Yes, so the French presidency of the European Union, of course, is a very timely one. They will oversee the adoption on the EU side of the compass, and as you pointed out, just a few months before NATO will adopt its concept. One thing to note is that as we speak, NATO and the EU are preparing a further joint statement of the institutional leaders, so Secretary General Stoltenberg with his EU counterparts, which follows up on 2 earlier joint statements in 2016 and 2018. And this joint statement should form a good basis for NATO-EU relations going forward. And I think it's very significant that such a statement will come out during the French presidency. Of course, I'm not in a position, I would not dare to comment directly on anything that the French president said, but in a more general way, let me say that I am quite optimistic because over the last years, I have seen allied consensus on China, on how to approach China, grow. And here, and this also ties in a bit with the question about whether the focus on Russia is desirable or not. NATO does not pick countries that it focuses on. NATO has the mission to deal with the security challenges that it faces, no matter where they emanate from. So of course, Russia poses very clear and present security challenges to us. NATO, China, as has been pointed out, poses certain systemic challenges, but is not an adversary at the moment. But there are also other challenges that are coming our way. I mean, terrorism remains a top priority for the alliance. We're also facing non-territorial challenges like climate change or pandemics, emerging disruptive technologies. So the way NATO operates is not that we're saying, oh, now we're going to focus on this country or that country. We're a defensive alliance. We look at the challenges that come our way, and that is what we respond to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. And thank you for pointing out that there will be a new joint NATO-EU leader statement soon. I think we all look forward to reading that, as that will be quite informative. Stephanie, back to you, because you mentioned earlier a very interesting topics, and I see some reflections in the chat box on that, which is the importance of dialogue. And you mentioned that in the past, NATO was better at having dialogue with China. And now in a recent press conference, the NATO Secretary General said that NATO and China are communicating at the military level, as well as at the diplomatic and political level, pointing to one video conference he had with the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. And I would like to ask you, would you advise NATO to hold more of these high-level meetings? What channels of diplomatic communication are most fit, you think? And may we expect at some point in the near future a structured NATO-China dialogue, or maybe even a NATO-China Council along the lines of the NATO-Russia Council? What are your thoughts about this, Stephanie, please?
Thank you also for these questions. And I start from the reverse. I don't think the time is right already to go for a NATO-China Council. I don't think that we are there politically for a number of reasons. And the reasons are not just in our camp, they're also with China, because I don't see an interest in China to make that relationship with NATO too much of a institutionalized formal structure. This may change over time, but not now. And if I may just add this as a footnote, I think Chinese diplomacy has demonstrated over the years that they really prefer bilateral relationships over multilateral relationships. I recall, again, back some 14, 15 years, they were really, really uncomfortable in dealing with NATO. This was an unknown enemy entity, strange animal for them. But they've learned. They have particularly learned how to play the multilateral piano, if I may say so, on the UN side in New York and in other multilateral organizations. So I think they are now by far more self-confident to approach a multilateral animal such as the European Union and NATO. But your question was about dialogue. Yeah, I don't know how much time I spent in my professional life crafting speaking notes for Secretary Generals, DepSecGens, and others for their encounters with Chinese ambassadors. Quite a number of hours I actually spent. So, and I must admit, I always found this useful for the two individuals to have that conversation. But again, I can only talk about my experience, but having twice a year, 3 times a conversation of half an hour, which is very much prescripted by the staff, where the two parties actually read from their speaking notes. This is not what I actually think I mean by having a dialogue. So there needs to be, I think, some instrument for the two that help to pave a way forward. And a very classical, not very original, I admit, instrument enabled to do so is to develop a joint roadmap. I mean, I don't know how many roadmaps we've developed, I mean, with all of our partner countries, which is just, you know, a guide for the two parties to agree on a meeting or a schedule of meetings, to agree on subjects, and then to slowly, gradually, you know, test your case, see how far you get, where we actually agree on themes and topics to have a more in-depth, more substantial dialogue, and then on which level. So I would advocate for NATO and China to go a bit beyond what we have in place now. I mean, to be a bit more ambitious and to develop as I said, a roadmap that would give them some skeleton, I mean, to work on. That could be done on staff level. I don't need to come up with my advice here. Robert and others know this firsthand. But again, this is an instrument which already exists for many years and has done good services for many other partner relationships that NATO has. In terms of themes and topics, if I were to make a list of top topics, of really important topics, from a NATO perspective, where we should have an interest, I would certainly put on top military transparency and risk reduction. Because we don't have with the Chinese anything in place that helps us to really shed some more and systematic light on a military to military relationship. If NATO allies are really eager, are really willing, I mean, to show more presence in the South China Sea and related region, I mean, there needs to be rules of engagements, and we don't have that yet in place. So that could be, you know, one very pragmatic step forward, or rather theme. I would, in order to make it not too difficult, and believing that it's always important for two parties to, quote unquote, make quick gains, I mean, see some progress in their relationship, I would actually put climate change on the agenda, not so much from a climate change perspective, but rather from a perspective of civil emergency planning. And what the Chinese have, in fact, over a number of years developed in terms of disaster response capabilities. They have struggled and are still struggling quite a bit with the fallouts of climate change themselves on their own territory. And over years, they have developed, I think, quite efficient and impressive capabilities how to deal with that. Again, I'm just describing a potential starting point. I'm not saying, I mean, we should but we should fall into praise for what they have been doing. But I simply would look at very pragmatic starting points in order to have a meaningful conversation. Climate change, as I said, civil emergency planning, disaster relief. And then on my third point, I would probably, as Robert already pointed out, I would probably place regional security issues. Afghanistan, not so sure if the Chinese actually still have an interest to talk with NATO about Afghanistan. We hardly play any role over there. But I'm talking more again from an allied security perspective, North Korea. Yeah, it's still a pariah state out there who preoccupies people as we speak, and as Aaron has already mentioned in the case of Russia, also under the quote-unquote preoccupation on Russia right now, the regime in Pyongyang it's doing its part in order to continue destabilizing the peninsula. Yeah, and our capitals can hardly digest. Yeah, can hardly follow. So again, these are just, you know, very quick points you could add to that. But I think there needs to be a more structured way forward with the Chinese.
Thank you.
And I'm pretty sure they have an interest.
Yeah. Thank you so very much, Stephanie. That is so insightful, and your very pragmatic suggestions, such as a joint roadmap, has given us a lot of food for thought. If I'm talking about myself, a lot of inspiration. And I would like to refer back to Robert, but I see that time is running short. So perhaps to conclude, we could do like a short round where in a few words you could mention what you see as the three most pressing challenges that NATO should address in its strategic concept towards China. And because what I remember from your very valuable interventions today is that yes, NATO sees China as posing a challenge, but that challenge is very multi-dimensional, non-militarily only. And we've heard a lot of elements, but if you could summarize in just a few words which challenges you find most pressing, which NATO should deal with in its strategy, I would love to hear that. We can do a tour de table in reverse order. So Stephanie, Robert, Aaron. Oh, sorry, that gives you less.
No, I'm just laughing. But I'm laughing because, I mean, your question is very good, but it sounds a little bit like an interview questions at NATO. I mean, come up with your three recommendations. I try to do my very best. Number one, I would certainly try to create a, if not joint, but synchronized toolbox with the European Union in terms of mitigating the effects of the various forms of Chinese intrusion on our economic system, technological system, infrastructure, etc. I'm putting this all in one box, but I think we need to have a real concrete, for the nations, concrete toolbox. What is it, I mean, that we want to do with that? Number two, I would put emphasis on watching China's maritime capabilities. We haven't spoken about this, but this is something that makes me nervous if I think about stated ambitions in China's military doctrine and strategy, in particular about protecting overseas bases and BRI capabilities. I'm wondering how this could eventually translate into protecting Chinese-owned terminals and ports in Europe. How do we have to prepare for that? What does that mean? Question mark. So yeah, I would look at NATO's military posture and maritime capabilities in the first place. And then I would certainly, I would really, echoing what has been made as a point already plenty of times, you know, I would really emphasize the simultaneous challenge posed by both Russia and China. I mean, from an academic level, from an intellectual level, I don't think it's that hard to grasp, from a political policy making level, I don't think we are prepared for strategic simultaneity. But
Wonderful.
we must, because
Very,
they're out there.
yeah, very interesting. Thank you. Robert, please, your thoughts on this?
Well, I think that the most important notion to be captured and that NATO needs to address is upholding the international rules-based order. And China poses certain systemic challenges to that international rules-based order. And this will undoubtedly be a recurring theme throughout the strategic concept. Besides that, I think that when you look at the impact of the rise of China insofar as it affects the alliance, we have to address those instances where, as the Secretary General put it, China is coming to us. NATO has no ambition to become a military player in the Indo-Pacific region. But Chinese actions and stated ambitions do have impact on the security configuration, both in our allied areas and adjacent to it. So that's something we also need to address, and this goes beyond the military domain, but it also covers challenges of economic security and, for example, the information space. Finally, China is an important factor that needs to be taken into account in the way that NATO addresses certain horizontal challenges, such as, for example, the need to keep a technological edge, the development of space as a NATO domain, cyber, of course, as well, and also climate change in a way, and that could indeed, as Stephanie pointed out, be something that provides the basis for a more positive conversation. To end on that note, thank you.
Wonderful, fascinating elements. Thank you very much. And then before I make the concluding remarks, please, Aaron, we would love to hear your views on this.
Well, I'm going to take advantage of the fact that I am an academic and not a current or even former government official. So all of my comments will be unrealistic and should be seen through that light. But I do think we need collectively to have some broader conception of what we're up against and how we need to respond to it. So I think we're up against this coordinated challenge from these big Eurasian authoritarian powers that are pushing outwards and trying to expand their sphere of influence and modify the international order in various ways. I think ultimately the response to that is going to have to be a more integrated collective response from democratic societies in the Western Hemisphere, in Western Europe, and in the Asia Pacific. It's going to have to be a ring of countries which will cooperate to varying degrees and in varying formats to defend their interests and defend their values. We don't perhaps like to say it that way. It sounds a little Cold War-ish. I think that's where we're going, whether we like it or not. And we're being driven there by the behavior of these authoritarian powers. So that's number one. And what's the big idea? I think it is to forge that alliance or coalition. Secondly, also, I realize unrealistic, at least at the moment. I think in order to do this, it's going to be necessary for democratic countries to limit their exposure to coercion, economic coercion, particularly from China. And that means not that they're going to decouple, but I think they're going to have to partially disengage themselves from China and from their dependence on the Chinese market in order to gain the freedom of action that they will need to do the other things necessary to defend themselves and defend their interests. And that's, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. I realize, how do you do that without having persuaded your populations that there is a problem? I think you can't, so you need to start on that. And maybe in this sense, the aggressive behavior of China and Russia both is accelerating that process, because some of the change that I observe, at least in Europe, has been driven by China's behavior just in the last couple of years, starting with the COVID pandemic. So we need to take advantage of that in order to move further in the direction that I think we need to go. One last thing I can't resist, no conversation between Americans and Europeans on security issues is complete without an American demand that Europe spend more money on its own defense. However, I think it's essential. It's inescapable. I mentioned it in passing. If the US is going to focus more on the Asia Pacific, it is going to be necessary for Europeans to do more to strengthen European defense. There's no way around it. I think people have recognized it to varying degrees and are starting to move towards it, but we've got a ways to go. And the same thing applies to the United States, by the way. We talk a good game, but if you look at our budget, we're not spending in the ways that I think we will have to if we are as serious about meeting these challenges as we say we are.
Thank you very much, Aaron. That's very insightful, and I think a record that in 1 hour and a half, burden sharing only comes up in the very last minute. No, thank you so much, everyone, Aaron, Robert, and Stephanie, for your valuable insights on how NATO is dealing with the strategic implications of China's rise. Thank you so much. Thank you as well again to the wonderful team at the German Marshall Fund and the American Fund, and to you, all of you, our dear audience. Thank you for your insightful questions and your active participation. I hope to see you all soon at another joint event. And we have one event lined up for you already next Wednesday, which is that we at the America Europe Fund are cooperating with the EU Engage project, and we're organizing a high-level lecture by Mr. Robert Cooper on learning from the past. Everything has a transatlantic dimension. As you know, Robert Cooper is an acclaimed diplomat and writer who served as Director General for External and Politico-Military Affairs at the General Secretariat of the Council of the EU, where he worked with Javier Solana on European foreign policy. So that should be very interesting. I hope to see you all there. Thank you to our speakers, to our organizers, to our audience. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.